Good morning. I'm Raymond, and this is my wife Mary. We are members of the Word of Faith Fellowship. Last time we were here, we spoke about God's plan and His keeping power in our lives. We all go through trials and afflictions and situations that we may not understand, and we may not see how God is bringing His plan in our lives. God is showing us that hope in Him is one way He brings us through these situations. Today we are going to share about how God worked that hope in our lives.
That's right. In 1 Peter 1:21, it says, "Through him you believe in, adhere to, rely on God, who raised him up from the dead and gave him honor and glory, so that your faith and hope are centered and rest in God." There's a lot of things we go through and a lot of things we went through, but if our hope is centered and rests in God, it helps to bring us through. And one example that I was reading about in the Bible was Joseph. And he went through a lot. And we know the story that his father loved him the most. He had two dreams where his brothers were going to bow down to him, and so his brothers hated him. But we know, and he knew by those dreams, that God had a plan for his life, something great in his life. But when it started off with his jealous brothers, the first thing that happened was they threw him in a pit and left him until some merchants came by and they sold him to the merchants. That was a hard place, I'm sure. But he obviously had hope in God, because his whole lifestyle shows that. The merchants sold him in Egypt to a man named Potiphar. And with Potiphar, in chapter 39, the Lord was with Joseph. And though a slave, he was a successful and prosperous man. It said that Potiphar didn't even think about anything but his clothes, because Joseph had a hold of everything. He gave his whole heart. He's a slave. Imagine a slave that would take that much responsibility. But his hope obviously was in God. He knew his final outcome. He knew what the plan of God was for him. But along the way, he may not have understood everything that happened. And even though he was successful, Potiphar saw the Lord was with him, and the Lord made all that he did to flourish and succeed. But we know that Potiphar's wife tried to deceive Joseph, and Joseph wouldn't go with it. But even though he had done nothing wrong, Potiphar had him thrown in prison. That could have been a low point, a very low point in Joseph's life. But his hope and faith was centered in God, and he walked with God. It was obvious in his lifestyle that he had a hold of God. And even in prison, the Lord was with Joseph, it says, showed him mercy and loving kindness, gave him favor in the sight of the warden. He was in charge of all the prisoners, and God was with him, and whatever he did, again, prospered. You know, he gave his whole heart. You know, he did what God wanted him to do, even in that situation. And even though we go through things and we may not understand why we're going through it, if we give our whole heart and we keep our eyes on Jesus and we hope that we know God has plans for us, then God can bring us through those and bring us up out of the pit, bring us out of the prison, even if we don't feel like there's a right that we should be there. And that's what God did in Joseph's life. And then we know in the prison that the butler and the baker came into the prison. And they'd had dreams, and the Bible said they had a sad countenance. And Joseph asked them, "Why are you so sad?" And they said, "We've had dreams and we don't know what they are." And so Joseph interpreted. It was going to go well for the butler and not for the baker. And he asked the butler, he said, "When it shall be well with you, show kindness, I beg of you, to me, and mention me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house. For I truly was carried away from the land of the Hebrews by unlawful force. And here too I've done nothing for which they should put me into the dungeon." He wanted out of that place. But as he was in that place, whether it was being sold into Egypt, working as a slave, being in a dungeon, even though he wanted out of this place, out of the dungeon, he still gave his whole heart to God. He still had hope in his heart that God had better things for him. I'm sure that he remembered that dream and the word of the Lord that came to him, that there were bigger and better plans for him in the end. And sometimes we know God has. Jeremiah 29 says, I know the thoughts and plans that I have for you, thoughts for welfare and peace, to give you hope in your final outcome. Because like Joseph, there's a lot of things we go through, and it doesn't look like, how could that be the plan of God? What's God going to do in my life? How's he going to get me through this? But if you have hope in your final outcome, because you know God has plans and purposes for you that are welfare and peace, and they're not for evil, even if it looks like evil, you can have your hope centered and rest on God, and it can help to carry you through those times. So when the butler went back to his place with Pharaoh, the Bible says he gave no thought to Joseph, and he forgot all about him.
But Joseph, he didn't give up in that situation. He had hope. In Psalms 27:14, it says, wait for and confidently expect the Lord. Be strong and let your heart take courage. Yes, wait for and confidently expect the Lord.
That's right, and that's what we want to do. We want to be brave. Sometimes going through things, you don't feel brave. You don't feel like you've got courage. But if you've got hope in your heart, we wait and we hope for, and we expect God's going to do something. Through the whole thing, God, you're going to do something. You're going to come. You're going to rescue me. It was 2 years later, as Joseph is still in the dungeon, that the Pharaoh has a dream. And he's concerned about it. He's asking everyone, what does it mean? What is this? And then the butler remembers Joseph. And he tells the Pharaoh, I had a dream, and he interpreted. Joseph got ready. He was called immediately. And the Pharaoh told him about his dreams. He had 2 dreams, which we're familiar with. And so Joseph told him that there were going to be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. And he began to tell Pharaoh about a plan. And this came from God. It's where he walked with God, heard the voice of God, and stood in that place with Pharaoh. And he told him, you need someone that can take hold of the years of plenty and gather the grain and store it. And he put it out in the plan, what should be done. And Pharaoh said, there's no man wiser than you to do this. You're going to do this. And he put Joseph in a place in charge of Pharaoh's house and over all the land. And he began to walk out that plan. That you can see right there. Then you can begin to see the plan of God that he had for Joseph. And it was very important, because everything Joseph went through to that point was preparing him to walk in the place to save his family's life, to save many people's lives that would have died and been destroyed in 7 years of famine. If God hadn't warned them and Joseph taken hold of all of them, then all of them would have probably eaten as normal, not saved anything, and then 7 years of famine would have wiped them out. But Joseph's hope in God through all he went through kept him stable, kept him resting and centered on God to help him through, to walk in his place at this time. And then we know that God brought his brothers there, and all that he went through to be restored to his brothers, because they went to Egypt to buy food. And Joseph told his brothers, don't be angry when he revealed himself to them, who he really was. Don't be angry at yourselves, because God sent him ahead of them to preserve life. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God. And sometimes in our lives we think, is this God doing this to us? It could be the devil meant something for evil. But Joseph saw, also he recognized the plan of God in his life, and that everything he went through prepared him for this time and brought him to this place for such a time as this, to bring deliverance to Egypt and to his family. So in Genesis 50, at the end of it, this was a very encouraging part also. All that he went through was obviously not for himself. It was for other people. But all that he went through also was so he could give hope to other people. When Joseph's father died, the brothers were worried again, because now that the father was gone, what was Joseph going to do? What was his heart really like? Was he holding something in his heart? Did he have bitterness? Did he have resentment towards what they did? And so they began to remind him what his father said. And he said, remember, our father said to forgive and not hold it, and we'll be your servants and we'll be your slaves. And at that point, when they were talking to him, Joseph wept, it said, because his heart was right with God. And in verse 19, Joseph said to them, "Fear not, for am I in the place of God? Vengeance is his, not mine." That was a developed character in Joseph, to be able to walk in that place. But had he not been able to be free from that bitterness, that resentment, and have the love of God in his heart for them, he wouldn't have been able to walk in the place that he did, first in Potiphar's house, then in the prison, and then in the call of God in Egypt when he was saving people's lives. And verse 20 says, "As for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are this day." He knew the purpose. He saw the plan. And there's many things that we go through, and we may not understand, was this the devil? Was this God? What is the plan of God? But we can know that God has thoughts and plans for us, for welfare and peace, and not for evil. It looked like evil what Joseph was going through. All of those things that happened to him, and he didn't do anything wrong. And you can say something happened to you, but what did I do, God? It doesn't matter. What is the thoughts and plans that God has for you? Are you going to hold on to hope in your final outcome, that if you rest your hope and center it on God, that he's going to bring you through it? He has something else better for me. If I can hold on to Jesus and hope that he's going to bring me out, then it's going to be good in my final outcome. And in verse 21 of Genesis 50, he spoke to him and he said, "Now therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and support you and your little ones." And he comforted them, imparting cheer, hope, strength, and he spoke to their hearts kindly. I love that part, because the work that God did in Joseph's heart with hope towards God, that was what he's imparting to others and to his brothers. And that's what we want to do. The hope that God brings us through things with, the hope in God. If we get that work done in our heart, then the purpose also is not just to fulfill the call of God in our life, but to impart hope. I want to impart cheer and hope and strength to other people when they're going through things. And I know what God did for me. That happened to me. I have an example. I went through a major trial in my life, and it was in January 2020. And I got a diagnosis that really no one expects to have. I was diagnosed with cancer. And a lot of times with that diagnosis comes a lot of devils that come at you with fear and hopelessness. And what are you going to do? You can't do anything about it. What's going to happen? Are they going to be able to get rid of it? It can go on unless you have hope in God and that there's another way. And when not only going through that, but in 2020 was the height of COVID, and it was the lockdown. And when we first started going to the doctors, you have to go to all kinds of doctor's appointments, and everything's whirling in your mind and in your life. Everything kind of changes. It's like it almost comes to a standstill of getting a hold of this in your life, and what are you going to do, and where are we going to go with this? And at first, when you went to the doctor, you had 2 people to come in because they want someone that can support you as well and help you walk through this. But as COVID, the lockdown came, each appointment, each place we would go, it would be a little different. Of course, the masks. And then I remember one time we went to the radiologist, and the sign was on the door that only the patient could go in. And I remember Raymond and I looked at each other, and he turned around and I had to go back to the car, and I pushed the door open and walked on in by myself. And that was a strange feeling, because especially at our church, our family, we all take hold of each other. Nobody goes through anything alone, and we still don't. And I still didn't then. But physically, I was walking into that place alone. And that's where it began.
Because both at that point in time, we went to where we could be in together, to where I could be in the lobby, to where I could not enter the building. Mm-hmm.
And that's where my heart, and I'm sure his too, was proven. Were we going to have hope in God? Was I going to go with all those thoughts swirling around? What are we going to do with what I felt in my body going through all of the treatments and the things you do? Or are we going to have a hold of Jesus through this? Are we going to let him walk us through it? And one thing also I never wanted that I had thought about, I'd never thought about cancer, was surgery. And I did not want to ever have to go through surgery. And now here I was in the hospital. He drops me off and I have to walk in there and I'm sitting in pre-op by myself. But I began to have my hope in Jesus because Isaiah 8:13 says, "The Lord of hosts, regard him as holy and honor his holy name." How do we regard him holy and honor him? By regarding him as your only hope of safety. One of the things I had to keep my mind on was the only way out of this was Jesus. The only way I could even go through this surgery, chemo after, radiation, and I didn't even know what any of that was like. But I had to keep my hope, have it in my heart that he was my only hope of safety. No matter what happened, he was. And when I sat in there, I began to think of that. I began to sing. They would come in, they wanted to give me certain medicines that I did not want and to calm me down. But I had Jesus. And if I kept my mind on him and I kept hope that I was going to go through it, I was going to wake up, and God had a hold of me on the other side of it. And the other thing also is I wondered, Jesus, how many people around me even had that? They also didn't have anyone with them. Everybody in the little rooms around me was alone. But I wasn't alone. I had Jesus. And I could really see the fruit of that, where situations like this, it comes down to the why. Are you really going to have a hold of Jesus? Is he really going to be my hope of safety? And Hebrews 6 says, verse 18, "This was so by two unchangeable things, his promise and his oath, in which it's impossible for God ever to prove false or deceive us. We who fled to him." Now, we didn't just go to him. That verse says fled to him, and that's what it feels like when you've been diagnosed with cancer. You flee to Jesus. You have to. For refuge might have mighty indwelling strength and strong encouragement. That's what I needed. I needed indwelling strength there by myself and strong encouragement to grasp and hold fast the hope appointed for us and set before us. God appointed that I'd have hope. He set it before me, just like he set before us life and death, and choose life. I had a choice. I could choose hope in my final outcome with this. And verse 19 says, "Now we have this hope as a sure and steadfast anchor." I'd never seen that hope was an anchor. I knew faith, trust, it all works together, but hope in God was to be a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul. It cannot slip. It cannot break down under whoever steps out onto it. A hope that reaches farther and enters into the very certainty of the presence within the veil. And that's what I needed through the whole thing, whether it was chemo, whether it was radiation. I mean, there's a lot to go through, but there was hope that would be an anchor for my soul that could help me go through this. And going through all of this, in Romans 5:4, it says, "Endurance develops maturity of character, approved faith, tried integrity, and character of this sort produces the habit of joyful and confident hope of eternal salvation." This was being developed in me if I let it. If I went to Jesus and let the hope be my anchor, this is what was being developed in me. I remember that I had a friend also who'd had a different type of cancer and had surgery. And I was just getting ready to go through all this, and she told me I was grateful for my surgery. I couldn't even think that way at that point. I said, "Jesus, but I've got to," because that's true. And if I have my hope in God, you can look back sometimes when you're going through those things and you can see what God's developing in you. And he wanted to develop in me a joyful and confident hope. I see hope as confident, trusting, I'm believing God, but joyful? Joyful was a different word in the meaning of hope. When you have hope, you can have joy through what you go through. I'm sure that Joseph had joy through what he went through. At times, it might have felt rough like it did with me, but he had joy. He had God. You know he did because of the places that God put him in his life, and the places of authority, the places standing before Pharaoh. Had to have been a shaky place, the leader of the land, and he had a dream. And Joseph didn't know, but God knew. And if your faith and your trust and your hope is in God, then you're going to know that God's going to come through. It develops that in you, a joyful, confident hope of eternal salvation. He knew God was going to be there and tell him what that was. I don't even know that he knew what would be the outcome when he did tell. Maybe go back to the dungeon again. But he didn't. That was the beginning of the plan in his life. And one of the situations that I went through, there were a lot. But in COVID, no one seemed to know what's going to happen. There was fear in that.
Right.
There was a lot in that. So when I went through that, I was getting ready to have surgery. It was January. I'd gotten doctors, had tests. I was supposed to have surgery right away in April, which was very quick compared to all that I had to do in preparation. And then I got COVID. And nobody wanted to touch me with COVID, which we see now. We look back and we say, COVID, I need surgery for cancer. This is not elective surgery. This is something I need to get it out. But they wouldn't do it. And they wouldn't touch it, and it delayed it. And I had to center and rest my hope in God that they started to give me medicine to try to keep it from growing, but I'm having to wait. But I'm waiting, as the verse that we had where it's at the beginning about hope, that we wait and expect God, expecting God to come through, having hope God's going to do something. Okay? We're delaying it. That's okay. God, I had to get my heart settled. God's going to have a hold of it.
That's right.
And then another time when I was going through chemotherapy, you had to be tested every time you turned around, every time you entered the building. Everything had to be a test. And so one of the tests said that I was positive. I did not feel in my heart that that was a true result. So I went and had it the next day. It was negative. But they were going to delay the chemotherapy anyway. And as people know, going through cancer, you don't delay that either. But God had a hold of my life. And I had hope in my final outcome that God's going to do something. He's going to get me through. No matter what happened at the end. I didn't know the end. But I knew God was going to have a hold of my life. In my final outcome, He was going to do something. He was going to be my safety. He was going to have a hold of me. And one particular instance as I was going through chemo, because I did start it back again, and they had decided for some reason not to do a port, but to each time do an IV. I'd never had trouble with IVs. You know, I could give blood, I could do an IV, it was no problem. I thought, okay, you know, at least I wouldn't have to have a port. So I started going in, and they would put an IV in, put the medicine in, and then it started getting harder because anyone that's been through chemo, you know, you don't feel like eating, you don't feel like drinking, and I must have gotten very dehydrated, and it got very difficult. And also, because of the surgery, I could only do the IV in one arm, and it could only be between my elbow and my wrist of my right arm. Okay, I still had not had trouble. I began to have trouble, bring more people in, and they would get it. So I began asking our church for prayer. I would tell them when I was going in, yes. And even if it wasn't an organized prayer at church, I knew people were praying, because I know that's how we are in our church. We're all family, and if somebody has something, we all pray. We all hold on. A text goes out, and we're all on it. So I knew this may have been the last time, but it was one of the times I went in for the IV. And the first time didn't work, and I knew everyone's praying. And it's at my mind, everyone's praying. It didn't work. Help me, Jesus. Was I going to have that hope in the final outcome? Was I going to have hope that God was going to be my anchor and it wasn't going to slip, it wasn't going to fall? I was a little shaky. They did it again. They brought other people in, did it again, and then they didn't get it. So they call another woman in. And this time she looks at me and says, "You know I'm your last chance." And I'm thinking, no, you're not. God is. But she goes, "If I don't get it this time, you go home." Well, I'd never known that. They didn't tell me that. I knew I had a certain space on my arm they could get it, but I didn't know if 3 times was my limit. But when she told me, "Do you know I'm your last chance?" Something in me, that hope that God had been developing in me and bringing in me those rough places, it rose up in me. And I was nice, but I said, "No, you're not." I said, "You're not my last hope." I said, "God's going to come through." I said, "It's going to work then. If this is the last time, it's going to work."
That's right.
And she got it in. And it wasn't her. It was God. God was that anchor of my soul, and it rose up in me. And I learned that a victory, in your final outcome, the victory is not how many times it takes. It's not what you go through on the way there.
That's right.
It's the end.
That's right.
And in the end of this particular trial, she got it. It worked. I got it. I went home, and I felt beginning to feel a little of the joyful hope and trust in God, because He did it. I don't have to look how many times it takes or what you have to go through to get there. It was hope. I began to feel the hope God's bringing me through, and I certainly wasn't at the end of everything. I wasn't finished with chemo. Had not gone through the radiation, and I didn't have the diagnosis that I have now that I'm cancer-free. And God was my hope, and He was my anchor, and He didn't let me fail. And I was grateful for that. And I learned a joyful and confident hope of eternal salvation.
That's right. You did. Yeah, in Psalm 62, it says in verse 5, it says, "For God alone my soul waits in silence and quietly submits to Him. For my hope is from Him. He is my rock and my salvation, my fortress and my defense. I will not be shaken or discouraged. On God my salvation and my glory rest. He is my rock of unyielding strength. My refuge is in God. Trust confidently in Him at all times, O people. Pour out your heart before Him." God is a refuge for us. And as Mary was saying, she learned that became very real because she was by herself. And physically, she wasn't by herself spiritually, but she was by herself physically. And
yes, because even during chemo, you go in there and there's a chair sitting right beside your chair. That chair is supposed to be someone who comes with you and can sit with you. And the chairs all around the people in there were empty.
yeah, it was.
But God was there.
But God was there. That's right. So, and I too had to get my heart anchored. And so where God anchored me is that He promised in Matthew 14, where after John the Baptist was beheaded and Jesus went away, the people found Him, and they saw that He was there, and so they came and they wanted to touch His garment. And so when they touched His garment, He would be healed. And it said He healed everyone, and they were perfectly restored. And that was the promise for me, that God said Mary would be perfectly restored. And she was. And like she said, it's not what you go through, it's
how you go through
it and where you end up. And so we're so grateful for that. It was trying times, but it was good times. You look back and you see that God helped you. He sustained you. You grew in faith. We grew together.
And I believe He developed that in me also, so that I can be like Joseph, and I can speak words of strength and hope to other people to help them through that. No matter what the outcome, God has a hold of you, and you can have hope and get through it.
That's right. That's right. So we're so grateful that God did that for us, and you can hear these programs Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 8:30 to 9 on this station, or watch them on the website at wordoffaithfellowship.org. Thank you, and have a great day.